Good morning. It's fantastic to see so many people here today. I've got far too many images to show, so I'm going to sort of bombard you with visual imagery. But it's a great opportunity for me to sort of talk about Gardens by the Bay, which is a garden in Singapore. And what I'm going to try and do is sort of cover how complicated gardens can be. At one level, it's just a beautiful place. It's got plants, and you can walk around and have a great time. But actually, this is a garden that's loaded with so many other things. Just going back 2006, when the project really started, there was a competition. And the brief for the competition was set by Singapore government. In no small sort of order, they basically wanted this to be a world-class tropical garden experience so that it will get tourists from all over the world. They wanted it to become the favorite place for Singaporeans to sort of go and visit, but they also wanted to be a showcase for their great horticultural sort of skills. Singapore being a garden city, probably one of the leading sort of tropical horticultural sort of expertise in the world, really. So they held a competition. There was three areas you can see on this plan, right in the sort of the developing area of Singapore. This is all reclaimed land, and I think the most creative thing, probably the most visionary thing about this whole project is actually the Singapore government allocating the space in a very landlocked sort of environment to landscape, to gardens, to open space. And the reason they did this was they recognized that actually as Singapore grows, it gets denser, higher density living, all the sort of challenges of the future, that they wanted to sort of make sure that the environment for the people living there, working there, visiting there, was of a quality that sort of suited the sense of Singapore as a sort of a garden city. It also sort of sat at the time when Singapore was sort of thinking about how does it sit in the world as a place, what's its identity, what's its brand. And they moved from calling themselves a garden city to a city in a garden, which is a very interesting sort of concept, the idea that the whole of Singapore is a garden, a sort of a nurtured, cultivated landscape. And Gardens by the Bay became the sort of the focus for what does that mean? What does it mean, sort of a city in a garden? It also sort of aligns itself with some very important projects that Singapore's been bringing on, including the Marina Bay Sands by Marina South architects, the Singapore Flyer. They're all called proposed on this plan, but actually they're all been built now. And so the whole sort of the skyline of this part of Singapore has changed radically. But anyway, back to the competition. This is it's sort of it's a garden, but actually landscapes, particularly urban landscapes today, in this day and age, are very complicated sort of propositions. And we put together a big team to sort of deliver this. And I think, if anything, this is a project which is about collaboration. It's about creative sort of synergy between lots of different sort of specialists. Ourselves as landscape architects, Wilkinson architects, Atelier 1 structural engineers, Atelier 10 environmental engineers, Land Design Studio and Interpretation, Educational Aspects, Thomas Matthews, Graphic Design, Bureau 4 Design Managers, etc., etc. There was a sort of a huge, big sort of list of team that came together. And on top of that, the client themselves, the National Parks Board for Singapore, were amazingly sort of visionary and skillful in helping us deliver the project. But all sort of great sort of projects start with an idea, and coming back to the original brief, what is this project about? The brief was, we want this to say something about Singapore, put Singapore on the maps. It's got to be Singaporean. Singapore, uniquely Singapore. These are all sort of things that were sort of flying around, the sort of Singapore Tourist Board branding of the place. And we hunted around for something to sort of think, okay, how do we root this? And the orchid was talked about. The orchid is the national flower of Singapore. And it was interesting to us because it's actually As a species, it's cosmopolitan. It's the most common species in the world. It's found in every place, 25,000 species of orchids around the world. It's also incredibly clever in terms of how it sort of adapts itself to quite challenging environments. The sort of epiphytic nature of it, it can sort of sit on a branch and grow happily, it can sit on a sort of mountainside and grow happily. So we thought how, these two things, one, it's beautiful, two, it's intelligent, it's sort of got the systems of it really work very nicely. So it became a sort of metaphor for the project. The stems became the paths, the flowers became the spatial gardens, the leaves became the earthworks, the root systems became the sort of clever infrastructure. So that was a sort of starting point. Parallel to that was the idea that this should be an exemplary ecosystem. How do we put in place on this new project in Singapore something that talks about the issues of sustainability in a tropical environment? How do we find relationships between buildings and landscape and find systems and cycles that work? And this is a diagram right from the competition stage which began to explore those points. At the competition stage, I mean, the main elements that we were looking for were to put onto the plan, this idea, the orchid sort of reference. There were some major structures that were a part of the original brief. There were two sort of conservatories that the client was after, basically air-conditioned glass houses, which in their own right present lots of sort of interesting challenges, which I'll talk about a bit later. But we sat those right on the waterfront so that they became a landmark in the city, and then grew the gardens from those out towards the rest of the city of Singapore. And here you can see the green being the sort of the earthworks, the orange path networks as the stems, and then sort of notionally a series of sort of events along the paths, the flowers. And we saw two opportunities here. One was, during the day, let's make a tropical garden that nobody's, the like of which nobody's really seen before, particularly exploring, showing off plants, tropical plants in the way that people haven't seen. Epiphytes particularly, I mean, the sort of, in Singapore, things grow so well, so fast, so big, that let's sort of, there was a sort of an implication that we needed to do something on a scale that was really interesting. And at the same time, how do we make this place a destination at night? The nighttime experience in Singapore becoming more and more important. It's more comfortable to be outside. But you need to sort of think about the ambience, the quality, and we thought it'd be really fun to sort of create a magical, take people out of the normal world and take them into a sort of magical, otherworldly experience. So the plan evolved during the master planning stage, got more sort of complicated, all the sort of elements started to fit together, how it fitted into the city. And as you can imagine, there was lots of sort of analysis about how this works. So from our point of view, the landscape sort of layers, shall we say, the idea, the sort of structure, the topography, the connectivity to the city, the water systems, the energy systems, the thematic framework for the gardens all started to sort of slot together into this diagram. And I think for us what was really interesting was the fact that this became an organic sort of framework, really. It's sort of self-generating in the way everything started to work together. I'm going to talk very quickly about the sort of gardens, because the gardens are about, plants. What do plants mean to us in the 21st century? And really that was the subtext of the brief, apart from it create this amazing place. How do we make something that sort of talks to us about plants and our relationship with the natural world? And the original brief from the client was, well, we just want to showcase horticulture. We want to sort of really have lots of flowers and lots of sort of colourful shrubs and really do things and show what Singapore can do from a horticultural perspective. And bring more species to Singapore, showcase things that haven't been seen before. But we thought it'd be more interesting to actually develop that idea a bit more. So the red on this plan represents area of the gardens which is really about the sort of the cultural relationship between plants and people, and particularly the cultures of Singapore, the sort of the Chinese, Malay, Indian, and Western. Each of them have particular associations with plants. The green is all about the significance of the Southeast Asian rainforest. What's the beauty, what's the qualities, what's the issues of a rainforest, and what do they mean to us in the future? So having this twin track approach, the sort of cultural framework and the ecological framework, became the sort of subtext to the whole approach. And that's showcased in a number of particular gardens that sort of sit around the sort of center of the garden experience. These direct sort of expression of that original diagram of the orchids with a number of sort of things. So we've got two trains of gardens here. One, the heritage gardens, which each of them talks a little bit about that sort of, let's say, the ethnobotany, the sort of cultural relationship of plants, people, and then the world of plants, which looks at different aspects of a rainforest. So this is a view from the top of Marina Bay Sands looking down onto the gardens as it is built, and I'm going to sort of run through lots of images. I mean, the significant thing is, in the future, this is a garden that's going to be locked in by, 200-meter high buildings. So, the sort of Singaporeans saw it as a sort of an important lung to the sort of future city. And at one level, yes, it needs to sort of express Singapore as sort of brave new, sort of forward-looking place, but it's also a garden. Somewhere that you can go and walk around, get in the shade, have an enjoyable time, and it's a sort of a part of that, sort of nice thing to do as a day out in Singapore. It was very important that it became a place for Singaporeans, for everybody to really enjoy. Very quickly, it became the sort of favorite place for people to take their wedding photographs. The four gardens, I'm going to quickly run through the four gardens. The Chinese garden, which talks about the sort of the literary association of plants and Chinese culture. Very, very quickly, developed sort of obviously significant sort of references to the sort of traditions of Chinese gardens. And significance of plants. The Indian garden, more about the sort of significance of trees, the sort of religious significance of trees, and particularly the Ficus bengalensis and the sort of big fig trees. Each of these fully sort of set out with educational opportunities so that people can go and just hang out there, or they can learn about some of these things in an interesting way. The Malay garden, more about just the sort of the plants and the kampong, the typical plants used on a day-by-day basis. So each of these are sort of mini immersive experiences, right, buried within this sort of bigger garden experience. The colonial garden records the sort of history of plants and trade. Singapore was an amazing sort of gateway to the sort of whole spice industry, rubber, et cetera, that sort of the colonial sort of world exploited. Then on the other side, more ecological stories about trees, the significance of trees, the significance of the soil zone, and the significance of biodiversity. We had a bit of fun with this one. This is the Web of Life garden, where we thought it'd be quite fun to do some big three-dimensional sort of animals and birds and plants, talking about the significance of the fig tree as a keystone species in the rainforest. And these are all species that actually depend on the fig for their survival. So we did them in topiary. It's sort of a 9-meter-long fig wasp, which is the most important species. It sort of pollinates the fig. But the whole thing about the gardens, I think, is this sort of, you can see here, this sort of really interesting dynamic sort of contrast, this organic relationship with the sort of city behind. Sort of 8-meter-high orangutan became part of that sort of story as well. And as part of the sort of the project, it's very important to sort of think about the climate. and create sort of plenty of shaded spaces, plenty of experiences that people could feel like they're in a garden, even if it's really sort of hot and really wet. And there's a lot of sort of covered walkways, a lot of covered spaces, and this is a sort of section through what became one of the main sort of dining areas in the project. It's almost like sort of subterranean, sort of cavernous sort of space, but we thought it'd be quite nice to sort of permeate this with planting, push planting through into the roof space. But this section also shows that actually a lot of the project is actually a roof garden. There's lots of interest these days in terms of green roofs and green walls and vertical greening, etc. And I think Gardens by the Bay has tested a lot of the sort of technologies to how to deliver that. And here's a view of the dining space as it was completed. So you can sit under this sort of great voluminous sort of space looking out to the sort of central gardens. Lots of thematic sort of things within the gardens, particularly structures. I mean, one of the things that we're interested in is colour, which I'll come on to, but also structures that allow plants to sort of really show themselves off. So at this moment in time, lots of the structures you'll see are sort of quite stark, but the idea is that these will be clothed in amazing tropical vines, tropical plants, which can then show off their flowers. So we did everything on a sort of super scale because most of these sort of tropical climbers are actually big and vigorous. So we wanted to really give them the chance to sort of show themselves off. So here's some more examples of that. And in time, this will be just this most amazing sort of tunnel walk of great sort of flowering vines and the likes. Just working with the sort of the organic reference, thinking about the paving, thinking about the sort of cellular structure of orchids, etc. Everything just sort of kept weaving its way through into the detailed design aspect of it. And it's very nice to sort of see how that sort of worked through. Other elements, stones, rocks, carvings, things that you found, there's extraordinary sort of collections of plants, things that are made, things that are, you get these extraordinary contrasts. But it was very interesting to sort of try and find a way of bringing in the sort of cultural references through these introduction of stone pieces. And obviously play aspects, very important. This is something that's yet to be completed, but working with the sort of same approach, the same language, just working it through into the sort of play structures. And branding and identity. Thomas Matthews from the UK worked with us on thinking about how do we set up a colour strategy for the project. And working with the idea of plants, we took the mangosteen as a sort of reference, the sort of great tropical fruit with this beautiful sort of dark purple outer skin, this luscious white sort of fruit in the centre, and then these amazing sort of shades of red and green that you get in different parts of it. So that became the sort of subtext for all the sort of the branding and the identity, right through into structures, gateways, day and night. But back to the environmental story. Having initially in the competition stage, we're quite naively sort of this will link to that, and we'll talk about biodiversity, we'll talk about sort of waste management systems. Fortunately, we had Atelier 10 working with us, and they sort of engineered that sort of system. So this is a proper engineering system, which I'm not going to try and sort of explain. But the net product of this was actually thinking through, okay, we've got some very important challenges here. One is energy. How do we create a sort of an environmental story that sort of makes sense when talking about air-conditioned greenhouses in the tropics? So I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but the key thing was to try and find a sort of a carbon neutral strategy for that, using sort of innovative technologies and putting things together that hadn't really been done before. At the same time, we're really interested about the water cycle and how we can actually really sort of do clever things with sort of waste management to sort of help sustain the gardens. This is just one of many, many sort of diagrams that started to talk about that. But water in Singapore, very, very important sort of emerging story. How do we nurture the sort of water supply, how do we keep it, how do we clean it, how do we start to embrace the resource management of something so important within the sort of day-to-day life of the city. And within this project, we've started to talk about how we collect the rainwater, how we filter the rainwater, how do we store it, how do we use water for enjoyment, how do we use it for irrigation, and ultimately it goes into the Marina channel there, which has now become a sort of effectively a freshwater reservoir. So it's all part of the infrastructure to sustain Singapore. In essence, that involved lots of sort of lake systems. I think one of the interesting things is, yes, there's a sort of an environmental framework for this, but actually there's also this amazing sort of scenic value of water. One of the key things of the whole plan is that you actually cross water to get into the gardens. From the city, you cross water. And in that process, you sort of leave the city behind, you go over the water, you get views across the water. So this amazing sort of sensory experience as well. And at the bottom, it shows the sort of section that starts to talk about aesthetic, sort of spatial experiences with water, contact with water, but also the ecological framework as well, sort of the wetlands, the sort of biodiversity, the sort of the opportunities for water to be this sort of rich habitat. And it was very important for us to sort of work through the idea of the nighttime experience. Working with LPA, Lighting Planners Associates from Tokyo and Singapore, it was interesting to think about what do we do with the garden in Singapore. And they started from the idea that, well, let's make it dark. Let's sort of cut out all of the light and then start to put the light back in where we want it. So to a lot of people, it sort of feels quite a dark sort of space, but actually it is fantastic to get out, step out of the well-lit, illuminated city with its laser beams and all sorts of things going on into a magical garden space. And you can start to develop sort of qualities of light, qualities of experience that are really very special. One of the sort of theme gardens, some of these sort of structures in the theme gardens become these extraordinary little places at night time. And some of the views become very memorable, more memorable at night perhaps. But on to the conservatories. These are amazing buildings that designed by Wilkinson Air Architects, the sort of basic form of these, sitting in the sort of the Singapore city skyline, and next to those the sort of super trees, which I'll come on to. But let's talk about the contents of these two conservatories. The client was very keen to bring plants to Singapore that they couldn't otherwise grow there, and to sort of have an opportunity for local Singaporeans to see plants that they may never have the chance to see in the wild. So the two sort of habitat zones. One was the red on these plans is the Mediterranean areas, Mediterranean, sort of California, Chile, South Africa, Australia. And then the green ones, the tropical mountain plants, cloud forests. Both threatened habitats, but both incredibly diverse in terms of their biodiversity and their plant life. So there were two environments. One was what became known as the flower dome, the largest of the sort of glass houses, sort of 1.2 hectares in area. And the key thing about that was that it needed an internal sort of temperature of around 23, 25 degrees and a relative humidity which was 60 to 80%. So it's relatively comfortable for people. And certainly, compared to the typical Singapore outdoor humidity and temperature, very, very pleasant for people. The cloud forest, similar temperature, but much more humid, so sort of sustain these amazing cloud forest species. So two very different plant collections, two different experiences, and we wanted to really play that off as we went into the developing the ideas. The idea that the flower dome being a cultivated world, it showcased these plants in a sort of more formal terraced environment, whereas the cloud forest become this much more three-dimensional immersive experience. It sort of sections through the two of them, just really trying to sort of show off the differences between the two. And in the flower dome, the idea that, there's lots of, it's about color, it's about sort of flowers, it's about, the scent. And one of the key things about the whole project is actually the environments are really about to serve plants. Yes, I mean, they're comfortable for people as well, but actually everything is structured around the light levels these things need for flowering, the temperature they need, the humidity, the opportunity to actually change those environments through the year to sort of trigger flowering, et cetera, et cetera. So the environmental conditions were very, very important to sort of make this work. And this is a sort of section through the glasshouse, which once again, I don't have time to explain it, but one of the key moves was actually to, rather than try and air condition the whole space, it's basically conditioned the space around the plants and around the people and allowed the hot air to rise to the top. Then it was then vented out or actually sucked back in to help part of the energy management systems. But here, I mean, the other thing is the complexity. I mean, this is all about collaboration, as I say, and I don't think anything shows it better than these sort of diagrams through the conservatories, where you can see the back of house, the plant rooms, the duct rooms, the structures, all these sort of issues, are then trying to sustain this garden experience. And lots of analysis required, the shading analysis from different sort of structural solutions, the sort of CFD analysis of the temperatures. These are complicated sort of spaces. And everything was looked at in very fine detail, even the sort of the structure for the glazing. The idea was to sort of minimize the sort of shading from the structure. So when it was overcast, lots of light got through to the plants. So these are just sort of little studies of how the sort of grid shell structure works. So you can see how refined that became to allow the minimum sort of shadow onto the plants below. And then back of house, enormous great sort of structures, big biomass boiler, which effectively delivers the carbon neutral strategy for the project. Another little detail of the interface with the structures, the cooling systems, the plant display. And some early ideas of, we wanted the flower dome to be this spectacular space with, flexible sort of areas, but, so weird and wonderful collections of plants. And in its raw state, you can see here, how the sort of structures began to take shape. You can see there all the sort of in the foreground, sort of all the sort of little black box, the sort of barcode sort of effect is the air diffuser system for the conservatory. So rather than lots of sort of huge, big sort of vertical diffusers, they're all embedded either in the floor or in the walls of the planters. And then when it opened last November for the World Orchid Festival, this extraordinary experience that it now has. Now on this image, one of the key things about the particular space was that when it gets really hot and sunny, it's almost too much for the glasshouse. So these sort of sunshades unfurl from the ribs of the building to sort of help to sort of mitigate the heat buildup. So it's very, very intelligent, very clever sort of systems. Coming back to this whole thing, this is about plants. And it's about the relationship of people and plants. And it's what's very nice is actually to see how people engage with plants in these places in different ways. I mean, the flower dome, you can see there the sort of these amazing sort of 1,000-year-old olives that should have been brought to play. Everybody out with their cameras, everybody sort of just wanting to sort of touch and smell and feel the sort of plants and learn about plants from different parts of the world. The cloud forest is a different space. This needed to have a sense of a mountain at the heart of it. So we thought we'd create this sort of rather interesting, abstract sort of mountain in the sort of heart of this sort of this conservatory, which is around about 60 meters high, and the mountain itself is around about 40 meters high. So this is, in essence, it's a building in the middle of the conservatory, which houses galleries, it houses multimedia sort of display areas, And the idea is that people come into the conservatory, they're taken up to the top of this mountain by lifts, and then people can walk down and experience the sort of three-dimensional qualities of a tropical rainforest through experience from the skywalks and taking your way through it. Once again, lots of sort of analysis of the environmental conditions to sort of make sure that it works for people and for the plants. There's an early image of the idea that you came into the cloud forest and you saw this amazing sort of waterfall structure, and the idea that the mountain itself is like this world of epiphytes, just clad with amazing plants from the tropical mountain. Here's a sort of cutaway diagram of the mountain itself. Amazing. I mean, it's effectively, it is the ultimate green building in terms of, it's clad entirely in plants. It's sort of got all these sort of windows in it so you can sort of begin to get the light coming into the sort of central spaces. It's got different microclimates depending on where you are. So this whole sort of thing starts to become this extraordinary sort of green, lush sort of structure. And here's a sort of a little bit of the how could we plant it? I mean, this is enormous, great 35-meter high edges, entirely clad in plants. So we came up with lots of strategies, including some of the conventional sort of little planters on ledges. But actually, the most important thing was actually that the whole surface became this organic render, shall we say. So rather than a sort of too clever, it's basically just a clever sort of a concrete render system with organic material, very porous, and we basically just stuck these plants onto the surface. And here it is in its full glory. You can see there some of the aerial walkways that you can experience the sort of space from. And at night, it does become an extraordinary other world. But as I say, it's all about let's look at plants, let's show plants, let's sort of let people learn about plants from these very beautiful, extraordinary places. And looking down on these plants from above is one of another sort of key aspect. So these skyways, these walkways, become a really important sort of part of the experience. As is the internal environment, the idea that you generate the mist, you generate the sort of sense of humidity, you generate these sort of sense of rainfall through clever sort of devices that sort of switch on through the day. And people just is really very interesting, the Cloud Dome, to see how people just really love the sort of rawness of it, this sort of sense of wonder, sense of these beautiful plants. And here's the waterfall. It looks like a sort of a strange alien beast, a spaceship has come to land. But another thread. I mean, the environmental, educational aspects of the project very important to the client right from the start. So rather than trying to make it too didactic, you will come to the Gardens by the Bay and you will learn about this. We're trying to make it much more subtle than that. So that, yes, you can pick up information. Yes, there are sort of subtext for school kids to learn about. And yes, there are actually some very, very hard-hitting sort of media displays about sort of climate change. But it's that sort of, it's a great experience. Yes, you can learn about it, unless you can come back and sort of find out more about it, the sort of opportunities. So that's the conservatories. So the last key element of the gardens are the super trees, which right from the beginning, we had this idea that we needed something in these gardens which said this is a garden. It's not just about two big glass houses and some greenery behind it. We wanted something to really sort of showcase say something about, what is landscape? What is the future of landscape and gardens in a city? How do we sort of really put something in here that talks to the agenda, in a way, the idea of identity, the idea of environmental infrastructure, the idea of beauty and experience, spatial experience. So we had this idea that we'd create these sort of vertical gardens. And in these sections, you can see how they begin to set into the garden. They became the sort of centerpiece. The tallest one is 50 meters high. The smallest one is 25 meters high. The tallest one has got a bar at the top, which you'll see in a few minutes, which is a great place to experience the project. And from the outset, it wasn't just about sort of what they look like and what they can do for plants. We saw the opportunity to use these to sort of embed lots of environmental technologies within them, whether it's solar power or rainwater harvesting, or they became venting systems for the conservatories. So multi-use sort of structures. And multi-use structures that have some very clever structural engineering. Once again, structural engineers are telling one, absolutely crucial to the delivery of the project, both for the conservatories and the super trees, with some very clever developments of structural, lightweight, dynamic structures that have an inherent sort of sense of nature, perhaps, but albeit highly abstracted. Once again, developing particular ways of actually creating these sort of vertical gardens on the structures, looking at the plant types, the idea that every tree had its own planting sort of identity. There's a little prototypes, the bromeliads. But what's really nice is actually the opportunities to sort of see some of these plants really up close and to sort of see different sort of displays. I mean, as I say, every tree has got its own sort of feel, every character, but you can get right up close to exquisite, beautiful little flowers, either at ground level or at the high level. It's got an aerial walkway, which is about 22 meters above the air, which we felt was really important because looking down on some of these gardens was actually key part of the experience. And it's a great sort of feel to be up in the air within the trees. And in time, the surrounding trees will grow up and you will feel much more immersed in the sort of the garden experience. But in addition to all those sort of things, environmental aspects, the sort of visual aspects, the super trees become the sort of the nighttime icon, I guess, of the whole project. LPA, developed some ideas with us about, getting the trees to talk to each other. So they're sort of sequenced into interesting, subtle displays, sometimes not so subtle, perhaps, but actually transform the sort of skyline into this beautiful, magical space. These are all real photographs, by the way. It's just really quite extraordinary. And it becomes a destination, a great sort of gathering point for people. And there's lots of speculation at the moment about sort of the royal family in the UK, about children. But they visited here in September, and they started talking about having children then. And what's been nice since then is actually Guns by the Bay has become a really favourite place for people to get married. So the 11th of this year, 94 people got married on the same day underneath the super trees. So bringing the whole thing full cycle, really, in terms of this is a place for Singapore people. It's a sort of a landmark destination. It's a sort of great showcase for lots of interesting technologies. And it's been a real pleasure for me to sort of been working on it for the last 6 years. Thank you.
Wow, really a wonderful project for Singapore. Congratulations very much. Now, we're able to ask a few questions after the presentation. And if you would like to ask questions, please raise your hand and our staff will give you the mic. Any Singaporean here? Yeah? Any Singaporean? Oh, you like the project? Yeah, the way you wave hand, I know you like it. Okay, first question, right?
Yes. I see a lot of work on design for the implementation of self-sufficient technologies in the project, but at the end of the day, how self-sufficient is it? Were you able to reach 100% self-sufficiency there?
The cooling of the conservatories is carbon neutral. There's a whole other issue about sort of embedded energy in the sort of structures, et cetera, but in terms of the operation, the main challenge was the cooling of the conservatories. And so by using the biomass boiler and liquid desiccant sort of systems as part of the sort of the whole process. There's a whole other hours talk about that, but what that has allowed us to do is to sort of create a carbon neutral environment, but also there's additional energy from that which is actually helping towards the running of the rest of the gardens. The big issue is the embedded energy that goes into constructing the project.
There's in fact, a lot of very ingenious ideas in that.
Yeah.
Okay, a second question. May I ask, how in fact have you in your career worked with engineers, architects, and make, well, ecological, creative habitats? And that's something which is not easy, myself, an architect, to work with them, right?
Throughout my career, that's been the main sort of agenda for me, and I find it very interesting. You know that this is obviously a very hot topic. Is sort of vegetated buildings. You know, how do we create habitats? How do we sort of create landscape that is architecture? And I think what a lot of architects, a lot of designers don't actually get is actually there is an extraordinary science to that. The sort of the science of the horticulture, the science of, you know, just sustaining these sort of living organisms. And so it's always a sort of in a way, an educational sort of challenge for us to sort of say, well, actually, you can't do that. You need to do this.
Yeah, but in this project, it's very, very successful integration, right?
Yeah.
Anyone would like take this opportunity to ask? Yes, the mic over there. Please stand up, please, so that we can see you. Yeah.
Good morning. Very good presentation. I'd like to ask a question. How did you convince the client to spend so much money?
Well, I have no idea. It was a very important project for Singapore. You know, one of our first meetings was actually to present the scheme to the whole Singapore government cabinet. So I think it got a buy-in right from the beginning that they wanted to commit to actually deliver this project. And there was a lot of commitment shown through the whole process from key ministers, from key people within the National Parks Board, across the whole of Singapore government, really, to sort of make sure that it was delivered. That's all I can say, really.
Anyway, you've got a very good client supporting this. Thank you very much, Andrew, this morning presenting such a wonderful project for us.